Hello, and another meditation on modern gods. And I'm going to suggest that there is a modern god which might need a bit of explaining. The god of culture. Now, I think these days many people define themselves by their culture, and in some ways they worship their culture. Their culture binds them like a religion binds people. Now, by culture, of course, it's hard to define, but what I mean by that is a whole pattern of life which has been inherited from previous generations, which is also being adapted by the current generation and will be passed on in due course to another generation. And that word culture covers so many things. There's high culture, of course, represented by works of art, music, dance, drama, architecture, that sort of thing. But there's also what you might call normal, common culture, and that often has an element of religious practice to it. All the rituals of life, from 21st birthday parties to funerals to all sorts of things, rites of passage ceremonies, but also more religious, obviously, weddings, christenings, funerals, that sort of thing. And of course the word culture is related to the word cult, and a cult is a pattern of worship and beliefs. But I think the emphasis in culture is not so much on doctrines and theology, but on practice. It's what people actually do in daily life that is really their culture. I've noticed, for instance, I've been to a secular funeral and a Western Buddhist funeral, and both of those looked awfully similar to traditional Anglican or Catholic ones. There was a little talk, which obviously wasn't called a sermon. There were sort of tributes paid to the deceased and so on. It all seemed very similar. And in a way, it's just adapting different doctrines to the same culture. And a common culture is a mass of assumptions about what is normal behaviour, what activity is appropriate, how to speak and act with some self-respect and respect for other people, social conventions that govern things like family life, business practice, sports and entertainments. They're all part of the culture. Different societies get excited about different sporting activities, although soccer seems to be fairly universal. Anyway, sometimes culture is invisible because it's just part of everyday life. It's what we do. It's what we've picked up from other people and from our parents. But sometimes culture does become very visible when we meet people from other cultures who have different practices and different expectations. And then you can get a clash of cultures. You can even have culture wars. Now, many Christian people, in my experience, Christians think that Western European or North American culture must be the best on offer. And the reason they think that is because they believe, they've been told, that Western culture has been heavily influenced by Christian ideas and values. I think that's usually an oversold opinion, but it's one that you'll hear everywhere. And so I've even heard the idea of something called Judeo-Christian culture. And it is true that for a few hundred years, not just northern, European powers have exercised considerable domination over the world, a succession of empires. The Portuguese Empire, the Spanish, the Dutch, I'm going roughly in order, the British and French, the German, the Belgian. All these European countries had empires over the world, and wherever they went, they tended to bring their own dominant culture with them. Now, everybody knew deep down that empire was mainly a smash and grab idea. The idea was to grab glory for the conquerors, wealth and power. But on top of that, there was also another idea that in the colonial period, it was seen as an opportunity to move the world into behaving in a more civilized way, that is, according to European culture. The first attempt was to Christianize the world in a Roman Catholic image by the Portuguese and the Spanish. The later attempt was more to instill the values of the Northern European Enlightenment, the modern mind, on the world. So the idea of universal human rights was brought in, the rule of law as a principle, rationalism as a way of seeing the world. The model of Western education was exported all over the place. Primary, secondary, tertiary education models. And there was a central role given to technology and the techniques which were aimed at managing the world and managing people. That technical, managerial approach to life which is characteristic of Europe and North America. But there's been a strong reaction. Other people, it seems, don't want to be civilized in that way. And so we have very strong reactions from various groups of people. Russian culture, Chinese culture, Indian culture, Islamic culture have all pushed back quite enthusiastically against that North European, North American model. And the Black History movement has arisen, pointing out that Western culture is very much the culture of the white guy. And the Northern European model is not nearly as superior as it likes to think. Or we have multiculturalism, the attempt to say that all cultures are equally of value, equally to be honoured. And so we get this effect of idolizing culture. You get the idea that either your own culture is the superior one and that becomes a kind of god to you, or sometimes you get people who are turncoats. They become passionate believers in the other culture that they have adopted. I've seen this with some white English people who have adopted the black culture of either the Caribbean or Africa. I've even seen English people pretending to be Irish and adopting an Irish culture. Everywhere, from Catalonia to Wales to all over the place, people are emphasizing my culture is important and valuable, it's best. So what does the Bible have to say about all this? Well, strangely enough, it's quite negative. The most clear example of the New Testament view of culture is in 1 Peter 1, and I'm going to read from verse 17. Since you call on a Father who judges each person's work impartially, live out your time as foreigners here in reverent fear. For you know that it was not with perishable things, such as silver or gold, that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. The empty way of life handed down to you. That's very negative. Who's he talking about? Well, there would have been 3 cultures represented in the churches there. There was the Jewish culture, there was the Roman culture, and the Greek culture. And what is interesting is that Peter relativizes them all into one simple expression: the empty way of life handed down to you by your forefathers. And he says, now you're foreigners. You're still living in the same culture, but now you're a foreigner. Now, Peter himself had once been a faithful son of Israel. He had a cultural prescription enshrined in the Old Testament, which had been developed by 1,000 years of history and theology and philosophy. But when he talks about being rescued from the empty way of life, he's also talking about that way of life, the one that he grew up in. Every culture is cut down to size by this verse. Now we are foreigners. We're not really at home in any culture. We don't really belong to the people we were born into even. The first verse of this letter of 1 Peter goes like this. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect, exiles, scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia and Bithynia. Exiles, scattered in the world. That's what a Christian is. He's an exile, she is an exile, scattered in the world. Because actually we don't fit in any culture anymore. We have a Father who judges our work impartially. Our work is not going to be judged by our culture, by our peers. Unfortunately, too many Western Christians still think the old culture of Christendom is Christian, but it isn't. It's an illusion. It's just another empty way of life handed down to us by our forefathers. I've got a lot more to say tomorrow about how this works in practice, but that's enough for today. Yes, culture is a real power, a force, a god in this world. But in relation to cultures, we Christians are, well, foreigners, exiles, even from our home cultures. Well, I hope that makes sense, and God bless you, and goodbye for now.